That was her freshman year, the first game they went to.
Look at what they wear to their games.
I know. And then even same thing there, Ohio State gear, head to toe.
That looks young.
Yeah, it's definitely aged us all significantly.
Being excited and kind to people, and it would really shift the tone of anywhere that she was at.
On February 9th, 2017, it was a cold, miserable, snowy day in Grove City, Ohio, when we got the call that a body was discovered in the Cider Grove Metro Park.
Hello? Hello, 911. Yeah, I think there's a body out here. Please send somebody, hurry.
I heard that there had been a body found. I knew there was a missing student, and I just told my boss, hey, I'm going.
What happened to Reagan, I think, is every woman's nightmare, every parent's, every friend's nightmare. You're just trying to live your life and get from point A to point B senseless.
Her last words was, I just want to live. And that's really all she wanted.
Some days I'm gonna wake up and it's all been a nightmare. And there's the picture that we used that you put on her chair for the wedding.
Yeah, why'd you pick this one?
Because it's pretty and it captures that light about her and all around her halo, you know. It's just so illuminating. Reagan came into this world like a burst of energy, the shining bright light that she was. She was born at 1:08 a.m. Boy, did she let everybody know that she was there, and she was just this.
And everybody was very tight-knit. We knew everybody on the street. Some kids grew up and became our babysitters, and we hosted all holidays, my entire childhood, being Thanksgiving and Christmas, and everybody was welcome at our house.
Reagan and her father loved a lot of the same things. Football, for example. Loved football, loved Ohio State, and that was her and Toby's thing. And I can remember a time that Toby took her to a football game at Ohio State when she was like 4 or 5, and she had her little Ohio State cheerleader outfit and everything on, and she had said at that game that she was going to go to school there. And sure enough, she did. There was a career opportunity for Toby that came about around holiday time of Reagan's senior year. We had made the decision as a family that she was going to be going off to college. Mackenzie was willing and open to move with us to this opportunity in Florida. And we moved that summer, and then she got settled at Ohio State.
The last special time that I had seen her was the last time we went and visited her in Ohio. This was the first time that I got to go and really sleep over at her apartment. She was very protective over me. And when Reagan was in the shower, her roommate came to me and said, do you want to go get some food with us? I thought it was the coolest thing that I got to be invited to go out and do something with these older girls. And Reagan called one of them and was like, what have you done with my little sister? Is she in the car with you right now? And she was so not happy that they took me out of the house without telling her. The next morning, our parents came over and they had just a really big tailgate, and that was, I think for all of us, a really core memory that we all have was getting to go to this game. It was her last game as a student.
I think if If Toby and I had to quantify something that we're really proud of, it was bringing our 2 daughters into this world and the way our family unit and network was. Very positive, very loving, very happy home.
Reagan's future was very bright. She had just gotten her first real job outside of college in Cleveland. She was about to move there. She was going to utilize her degree in psychology and essentially try to help people because she cared so much about them.
Reagan consistently would always talk to my dad to check in with him every day and let him know that she made it home safe.
Her and I had a conversation that day, 3:45, I'll never forget, because I was in a Walmart and I was talking on the phone and pushing the cart at the same time, and I had crashed it into a display of bananas while I was on the phone with her. And she was laughing at me and she was like, "Seriously, Mom?" But her and I had a very fun, bantery conversation that day. Reagan was going to work that night, and it was a new job. We weren't super thrilled about it. The fact that this job was keeping her out in the evenings, she was excited about it because she was looking for additional ways to earn some money.
On the 8th, we hadn't heard from her, and it started to get a little suspicious, but on one hand, my dad was growing more and more concerned, and on the other, you had to remind yourself that she was 21 years old, almost 22. She was a full-fledged grown-up at that point, but I knew when we had gone to bed that night, it was just a little off in our house.
She had talked to my husband right prior to going into work, but when she didn't text, he was uneasy because he hadn't been able to get a hold of her, and her phone went right to voicemail.
The next morning I got up and I was getting ready for school, and I went down and had my breakfast like normal, and my mom had my lunch sitting out, and when I went to leave, they both told me, "If you hear from your sister today, let us know immediately." And to me, that was kind of a red flag.
As time had started to progress, we're getting really uncomfortable. I called her work, and they hadn't heard from her. I was not able to report her as missing because I was not the last person to see her. So they had to call.
So we had a employee leave work last night, and she has not been home. Her phone is off. Nobody can find her. She hasn't been home at all either. Her mom's been calling, looking for her. We can't find her car around work.
I was getting ready to tweet this photo, and I thought, if I tweet this out, one, that makes this very real, and two, if she ends up being completely fine, there's no way of taking this back. But I tweeted it out, and it instantly started to go off like wildfire, and I had people get my cell phone and start reaching out to me somehow, and news stations and broadcasters and etc.
The roommates had confirmed that her bed hadn't been slept in. And obviously that was very concerning because she never did anything like that. She always came home. And what we didn't know at that point was there was a Jane Doe that had been found. Mackenzie was at work and Toby and I were home. We were trying to stay off of our phones so that if we got a phone call, sorry, this is going to take me a minute.
Hello? Hello, 911. Yeah, I think there's a body out here at Scioto Grove Metro Park. I don't know if this is a fake or what. I'm afraid to get close to it. Please send somebody, hurry.
Okay, don't get near it.
It's bloody. It's got the arm over its face. I'm afraid to get near it. I can't tell if it's fake or what, man.
Can you tell if it's a male or female or anything like that? It's a female. I don't think this person's alive.
The information that we got on the call was an individual saw what they believed to be a body laying probably about 50 feet off the road. We immediately dispatched officers out to that area to find out what was going on.
Working in the prosecutor's office, we would frequently hear about offenses or homicides that took place. I found out pretty quickly after a body had been found. There was no identifying information, her purse was gone, no cell phone, anything like that. So the Grove City Police Department had to coordinate locally and see if there were any reports of missing people.
We had confirmation from our patrol officers who arrived on the scene that it was a human being.
But there is possibly a body. It's going to be, he said, possibly a female who is bloody with an arm over the face.
I was one of the first investigators to approach the body, and you could see that it was a young female in her 20s. She didn't have any clothes on. She was wearing a necklace, and she had an apparent gun wound to the back of her head. Since she didn't have any clothes on, we were looking for identification, purse, or anything along the lines of that. The entrance to the park, there was a few houses out around there. We started to go out there and scour the area and talk to witnesses and see if they heard anything, if they saw anything, and no one had.
I was in the newsroom when I heard that there had been a body found at Scioto Grove Metro Park, and I remember at this point, I knew there was a missing student. As a reporter, your main goal is to report true and accurate information. So as much as your mind might want to say, hey, I know there's a missing Ohio State student, I know right now there's a young woman who has been found, you cannot in any way tell people that. Of course it comes to mind, but you can't really assume anything.
We started searching databases to try to get an identity on who the victim may be. We got a phone call from some females in the campus area of Ohio State University, along with Short North area, of a friend of theirs that matched the description of the victim that was missing, and they haven't seen or heard of from her for over 24 hours. We showed the friends the necklace and the tattoo that we had taken photographs of. They looked at both of those and they were able to say, yes, that's a matching tattoo that Reagan had, and that's the necklace that she would have been worn. Once we had a pretty good idea that it was Reagan, we still needed to make the 100% identification from a family or a friend of Reagan. So we had to reach out to the family and let them know.
I got this phone call, and this guy, he asked me if I was by myself or if Toby was with me. And I'm like, no, Toby is here with me. And then he just proceeded to tell me that a body of a young woman had been found that morning in Scioto Grove Metro Park. They were fairly certain that it was Reagan. And there's nothing in this world that would ever prepare a parent to get a phone call like that. And I can remember just standing there saying, you have to be mistaken. It can't be. That's, it's not her.
People around Ohio State were rightfully scared, and this could have been any Ohio State student. So people were rightfully upset, people were scared, people were wondering, do we have a killer on the loose? And they did. The day she was found, we did not find out from police on that day that this was Reagan. They told the family, they told friends, but police did not publicly put that out there until the next day.
Looking back on it, a lot of it is a blur. I can remember this information was out there and the media had started to pick up on it. We knew we needed to get to Mackenzie because she had put it out on social media that her sister was missing and was asking for help and all of that. And we did not want her hearing this from anybody but us. And so we got into the car and we drove up to where she worked. And she took one look at Toby and I and immediately knew something was horribly, horribly wrong.
I instantly knew what had happened just from the looks of their faces. I knew that she wasn't found alive. She had been found dead. The look on their faces was, it's not like she had been in a car accident and something like that happened. It was complete and utter devastation.
I just kept hoping and praying that it was a mistake. And my brother actually was en route to go to the morgue to identify her because obviously we were in Florida. And I just kept praying he was going to get there and he was going to call me and say, no, it's not her. But that's not the call that we got.
One of the worst things I've ever did as a journalist, as far as the impact it had on me, is I went to Reagan's apartment, knocked on the door, her roommates opened the door, just clearly in hysterics. At that point, it was pretty clear that while police hadn't told us yet, this was Reagan who had been found. We didn't have anything until maybe 10, 15 minutes before the 11 o'clock news that we could report as fact and know that it was Reagan.
We went from looking for her and thinking that she was out there alive or had been in an accident and couldn't get a hold of us, or that even maybe she was being held hostage somewhere. I don't think our mind ever went straight to that she was not going to be found alive. So when we did hear that and hear those words, I think we all just went into a state of complete shock.
It literally feels like somebody has sucked all the air out of your lungs and kicked you in the stomach at the same time. And we knew at this point that the person they thought was Reagan at that point had been shot.
When the police discovered Reagan's body, they were initially unaware of what happened to her, but the autopsy revealed that she had 2 bullet wounds in the back of her head, one of which was fired at close range.
We believe that it was going to be a murder investigation because there was no weapon around for this to be self-inflicted. We didn't know if this was going to be a domestic-related issue, if the killer would have known the victim at the time, or exactly what we had on our hands at that particular moment. First 24 hours of a homicide investigation is very important because you need to track down as many leads as you possibly can find, and so that we can quickly try to recover any evidence and get the case resolved.
There were some aspects of the way that Reagan died and what happened in her last moments that suggest this killer really wanted to demean her in her last moments. She was forced to undress and was found laying naked. This is, of course, very upsetting for the family, but you can imagine for Reagan, she was trying to comply, hoping that it may save her life, but it didn't.
The police, by gathering that surveillance footage from the bodega bar, they were able to determine what time she had last been seen alive. And then kind of work their way from there to see had anybody else seen her, or had contact with her within her inner circles, or anybody that knew who she was once she walked out of the bar that night.
This is a video of Reagan leaving the bar that evening. It's her saying goodbye to the bartender. And as she walks out the door, we're watching this to see if anyone follows her. She walks down the street.
Push it up. Got on here real quick.
When we found out he was arrested, I think there's a big sense of relief that someone got caught. And then it's almost immediately like, why? Like, why would someone do this to an innocent girl? There was no connection between the two.
You'll be able to talk to Detective Deskins here soon enough.
Brian Goldsby was not a Grove City local, and he was not known to Grove City Police, but he was certainly known to the Columbus Police Department, as well as the Ohio prison system. Brian Goldsby had been released from prison not too long before this offense. He had committed a very similar offense against another woman where he had sexually assaulted her, held her against her will, but in that instance, he let her live, he let her get away. She reported it and he ended up going to prison for several years.
There was a woman that he held at knife point and raped in front of her child. A plea deal was given to him, and he had reduced sentencing time that he shouldn't have had. And had this ridiculous situation not happened with his prior sentencing, he would never have been on the street that night and should have never crossed paths with my daughter, and she would still be here with us.
Knowing that he only did 6 years in prison for his previous crimes was very disheartening, very disappointing to not only me, but the other investigators or officers that had worked on that case.
He was staying kind of, I believe we refer to them as halfway houses for people who had been out of jail, but still were kind of working their way back into normal society. And that's where he had been staying at the time. And they found Reagan's car nearby them. So he was still fresh out of jail.
Detective Deskins will be in here, and I don't know if he's let off your one or not, to be honest with you. I don't have any on me.
Once Brian was arrested and being brought back to the police department, I knew that we had to formulate a plan. I knew that I had to have someone else in the room with me so that we could effectively interview Brian. I also knew that we couldn't just go in there with nothing in our hands. So some of the strategy was to, since we knew where Reagan was parked at, to go onto Google and print off photographs of the street view area. Just so he wouldn't know where those photographs came from. He wouldn't know if it was surveillance video or what type of photographs we had.
You keep telling me into something I didn't do. I honestly don't understand.
Well, this is what's going to happen. So during the interview, Brian did admit to the kidnapping part of Reagan. He admitted to making Reagan drive him around to different locations and getting money out of an ATM. He also admitted to raping her during one of the cigarette breaks that we had. However, he would not admit to him being the one that shot her.
He said that he had run into an old friend named TJ, and that TJ was the person that had actually pulled the trigger and killed Reagan.
He said that once they got to the park, he's the one that exited the vehicle with Reagan, made her take all of her clothes off, and as she was walking away, TJ pulled the gun up and shot her in the back of the head, and then advanced on her again and shot her again on the side of the head. We at no time believed that a TJ existed. It was just a way for Brian to tell us the story by diverting the actual murder away from him and onto someone else.
I think it became clear to him that the police had evidence, and so he had to sort of scramble and develop this fictional TJ that had committed the offense.
Yeah. She walks out in the grass. Yes. That's kind of down the hill. I said stop. And you said stop. And then you balls out and gone. I said don't move for 30 minutes. Why'd she say all I want to do is live? I got you.
It was very important throughout this interview process for us to find the murder weapon. After about an hour and a half of talking to him specifically about the location of this weapon, he finally told me, all right, I'll tell you where the weapon's at if you could give me a couple hamburgers. As soon as Brian started eating one of the hamburgers, he said that he threw it in the storm sewer grate and gave me the location of where it was at.
One of the other detectives that was interviewing Brian Goldsby had built a rapport with him, and when they left the interview room to go into another part of the police station to have a cigarette, something like that, at that time, Brian Goldsby admitted that he had killed Reagan. I don't think he ever acknowledged there was no TJ in the interview with Detective Forney.
He says, walk until I tell you to stop. She walks, she's naked. She walks, he tells her to stop. Nothing happens, so I'm thinking the gun that he gave me was fake. And then he goes, pow! She falls. She's laying on the ground. I'm looking on the car, and he bends down and shoots her again. Pow!
During the interview, we realized that Brian had an ankle bracelet attached to his ankle from the conditions of his parole. At the time, we did not know that it was GPS enabled, that he was being tracked continuously.
He's a registered Tier 3 sex offender, which means he's committed sexual crimes in the past. We know that. He's got this GPS monitor on. It's tracking him, but they're not actively watching what he's doing, as I think a lot of people assume they would.
What it revealed was at the moment that he kidnaps Reagan, the GPS also had his speed that he was walking or riding or driving a vehicle. You can see where the speed went from 2 to 3 miles per hour of him walking to all of a sudden now he's going 25, 35, 40 miles an hour.
GPS coordinates put him at every single place that Reagan had been. Everything was lining up with where his ankle monitor had gone.
So Brian took a bus from his halfway house where he was staying at to this area. He got off the bus a couple blocks down aimlessly around the city, just waiting to try to find someone to take advantage of. And when Reagan was walking down this street, that presented that situation for him. And this is where he intercepted her down here at her car.
And we knew at that point that he was in Reagan's car. It matched up the timeline with Reagan leaving the bar.
At one point, he had Reagan Tokes drive from her place of work, Bodega, throughout some of the downtown Columbus area. He had her stop at several ATMs.
Reagan would have been terrified at this point, having a stranger in her car with a gun, not knowing what was going to happen, where she was going to go, and him just telling her to turn at different points during her drive. So one of Brian's goals for the night was to rob Reagan. So he forced her to drive to the First Bank and withdraw some money. They were unsuccessful. Drove to another bank and tried another card. Again, they were unsuccessful.
The car was stopped for a period of time in the German Village area, which is right on the outskirts of downtown Columbus.
German Village is a nice part of town, but it also has this criminal element to it. And they parked in this location here, probably up against one of these buildings. So he forced her to remove her clothing. I'm sure Reagan was absolutely in shock and terrified and unable to do much because he had the gun pointed at her while he raped her.
I think that was one of the hardest things for me to view, that piece of evidence and that particular part of the GPS evidence, because I could see how maybe she had some hope that he was going to let her go.
So once they leave this location and when Brian has raped her, now they drive back to the First Bank, the Chase Bank, and go through the ATM machine again. And Reagan is successful in withdrawing $60 from her account. The only other video that we had of Reagan and Brian was at the gas station where they put gas into Reagan's car.
I think as we started to get all of those details, it just made you so angry to hear that how long she had been kidnapped for. It went on for hours. To think that she was marched out to a field and killed like an execution, just, you can't even comprehend what she must have been thinking, other than what we do know her last words was, "I just want to live." And that's really all she wanted. She wanted to be able to come home and get to see her family again.
And look, do you remember that?
Oh, look at her little jacket.
I know, with her little jacket on. And you still had your braces on there, but remember we sent that to Dad for Valentine's Day. That was the picture we took, and we made him a Valentine.
Reagan was a very kind-hearted person. Her friends would always say that she had like a song for everything. So if she was making a bagel, she'd sing a song about the bagel she was gonna eat, or she just was constantly talking or having chatter or wanting to have a good time.
It was unbelievable the amount of people that attended her funeral. And came to not only honor her, but to support us as well.
Her funeral was held on Valentine's Day. My mom and I always said we were so sore after from so many hugs that we had given to people.
I can remember at her funeral, a young lady talked to me about how she was a classmate of Reagan's, and she was going through a terrible family situation at the time that she came to the school. And Reagan was the one person that was very kind and welcoming to her and invited her to sit with her at lunch and became her friend and introduced her to other people. And she literally ended up only being there for like a week because of what was going on in her family. She's like, but I went through, the rest of my life saying Reagan Tokes was my friend. So that's the kind of person she was. It was a year before this actually went to trial. To sit in the same room with her killer was horrible. But I went into that trial resigned with the thought process that I knew justice would serve itself appropriately for Reagan and that we would accept the outcome.
Brian Goolsby did stand up and apologize for what he had done and admitted that there was no mysterious TJ. There was no other person that had committed the offense, but he still was very subdued. I think that was hard for some people to take as a genuine expression of remorse.
It was a really long trial, and my parents had gone to all of the days leading up to the final sentencing day, and I had come in to attend the sentencing. There were times where we would leave the room when they were talking about something in great detail or showing any sort of images from the crime scene.
Brian was very well coached in court. He would just sit there and do what his attorneys told him to do because he knew that the evidence that we had against him was pretty substantial and that he was looking at the death penalty. So he was trying to do everything that he could to avoid the death penalty.
Brian Goolsby's defense team brought up his upbringing because we were seeking the death penalty. I don't know that I agree with all of it because there's a lot of people that face adversity in their childhood and do not end up committing offenses like Brian Goolsby did, but in this particular instance, I think it resonated with the jury.
We were sent home and we were worried just that maybe it wouldn't finish up in that day. But we ended up getting a phone call that we needed to be back there almost immediately.
The jury thought that based upon the evidence that his defense team presented, that a sentence of life without parole in the prison system was the best result.
Even though the evidence was so clear that this was the right person, there's still a fear in your mind. And so I think when we all heard that he was guilty on all counts, it was very relieving for us because we knew we had done and the police had done and our counsel had done what they said they would do, and that was to get justice for Reagan. And the verdict fell on her 23rd birthday.
My personal impression of Brian was that he didn't care that he took the life of an innocent victim. He was very self-centered and could care less about anyone else on this planet. And if he wouldn't have been caught, he probably most likely would have done this again.
To know that he will have to sit there forever is a really good feeling, to know that he would never be able to harm somebody again. I hope he's haunted every day for what he's done. I hope he has hell on earth and then he'll have hell in the afterlife.
Does it bring my daughter back? Does it give me complete peace and calm? Do I feel complete justice over it? No, I don't. I don't, and I would be a liar if I was not honest about that.
Seeing my parents go through this, it 100% broke them. And with my mom, I think for her, she has to be doing something. And so that's how the foundation came about, and just really wanting to find justice for Reagan and do good by her.
After Reagan was murdered, her parents almost immediately jumped into action. I've never seen anything like it. It was immediate from them. They wanted to make change. They wanted to make sure that no one else had to endure what they had to endure.
The Reagan-Tokes Act is something that her parents really championed. Brian Goldsby had been released from prison and was on supervision. And the Reagan-Tokes Act allows judges to give what we call an indeterminate sentence.
The first part of the Reagan-Tokes Act is actually now in law in the state of Ohio. The second half deals with the ankle monitoring and the monitoring in real time with consequences for that as well. Because I'm sorry, there is no price that I would put that would be too high or too valuable on my daughter's life. Evil does not get to have the last word in this.
It scared me to lose her and to lose the identity of having an older sister that I knew was always looking out for me. 100% robs you of any childhood I had left. Reagan and I always had a back and forth banter of who would be the first to get married, who would be the first to have children. And the other difficult thing is I met my husband in college, and so of course he's never gotten to meet Reagan. On the wedding day, we honored her in a few different ways. I had a chair saved in the front row of the chapel for Reagan, and I had asked my florist if they could incorporate her favorite flower, which was an orchid. And then I had asked my mom to bring a photo of her so that it could be kind of like we saved a seat for her.
It's really quite remarkable what Reagan's legacy through the Reagan Delaney Tokes Memorial Foundation has been able to accomplish. And we've raised a considerable amount of money and awarded upwards of $400,000 of scholarships at this point to well-deserving students.
The community definitely still remembers Reagan and what happened to her. The park where her body was found now has a memorial with a swing, lots of great flowers and plants. I think that the Tokes are remarkable people, that they have taken this tragedy and really tried to make change as a result of it.
I would love Reagan to be remembered for the kind, loving, generous, bright light spirit that she was. She was a good friend. She loved her family. She loved the Lord. She had her faith. She went out into the world and she did good things.
It's a very strange concept to think of that she will no longer be a part of our present and future experiences through life. But we know that she's looking down on us and she's watching everything that we do. I think she would be really proud to know that we've created the legacy in her honor so that she can continue on with us.
The phone rang at exactly 2:17 on a bitter January morning. No greeting, no hesitation, just a low, trembling voice wrapped in static. You buried the wrong man. The real one still lives near Blackwater Creek. Check the old Miller farm. You'll find what everyone missed. The line went dead. No name. No explanation. No second chance. For the dispatcher in Hanover County, Virginia, it sounded like another anonymous prank. One more strange call in a county that had carried an unsolved murder for more than 40 years. The message was typed into a routine incident log, assigned a reference number, and nearly forgotten before sunrise. It should have disappeared into the archives like hundreds of tips before it. Instead, it became the first crack in a wall of silence that had stood since the winter of 1983. Long before DNA databases. Long before cell phones. Long before surveillance cameras watched every intersection. There had only been snow-covered roads, fading tire tracks, frightened witnesses, and a town that believed evil only happened somewhere else. Until one freezing night proved otherwise. Hanover County looked peaceful from a distance. Rolling farmland. Quiet churches. Two-lane highways stretching through forests of oak and pine. Families who had known one another for generations. Children riding bicycles without fear. Front doors left unlocked. The kind of place where everyone waved at passing trucks because every driver looked familiar. But every small town has a story it refuses to forget. This one began on December 19th, 1983. 26-year-old Rebecca Lawson locked the front door of the county library just after 6 in the evening. Christmas decorations glowed softly in the windows along Main Street. Snowflakes drifted beneath yellow streetlights. Holiday music echoed from a nearby diner where families gathered for dinner before the coming storm. Rebecca smiled at an elderly couple carrying wrapped presents across the street. She pulled her wool coat tighter against the cold. Then she climbed into her blue 1979 Chevrolet Malibu. She had planned to drive 15 minutes home. She never arrived. At first, nobody panicked. Her parents assumed icy roads had delayed her. Her fiancé believed she'd stopped to help someone. Friends expected her to call the next morning. But dawn arrived without a phone call. By noon, concern turned into fear. By sunset, deputies were searching every road leading out of town. Her car was discovered 22 miles away on a narrow gravel road near Blackwater Creek. The engine was cold. The driver's door stood open. Her purse rested neatly on the passenger seat. Her keys were still in the ignition. The headlights remained switched on until the battery finally died sometime during the night. Nothing looked stolen. Nothing looked disturbed. It was as if Rebecca had simply stepped outside for a moment and vanished. The first deputies on scene immediately noticed something that made no sense. Fresh snow covered the surrounding fields. Yet there was only one clear set of footprints leading away from the driver's side. Rebecca's. No second trail. No obvious struggle. No drag marks. The footprints stopped near the frozen edge of Blackwater Creek. Beyond that point, nothing. Investigators searched the icy water. They searched the woods. They searched abandoned barns, drainage ditches, hunting cabins, and every nearby property. Hundreds of volunteers joined the effort. National Guard helicopters flew overhead. Search dogs combed frozen fields. Divers broke through thick ice. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Rebecca Lawson had disappeared without leaving a trace. The headlines spread across Virginia. Local librarian missing. Mystery at Blackwater Creek. No suspects. No answers. Television crews filled Main Street. Reporters interviewed neighbors. Psychics claimed to know where she was buried. Letters flooded the sheriff's office. Every tip created new hope. Every dead end deepened the nightmare. Then, 6 weeks after Rebecca disappeared, a teenage hunter discovered human remains nearly 5 miles downstream beneath a collapsed section of riverbank hidden by fallen trees. The identification took only hours. Dental records confirmed the worst. Rebecca Lawson had been murdered. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma followed by strangulation. The medical examiner estimated she died only hours after leaving the library. The entire county changed overnight. Parents no longer allowed children to walk alone. Businesses closed before dark. Church parking lots emptied early. For the first time in memory, fear replaced familiarity. Someone living among them had committed murder. And nobody knew who. Detectives established a task force unlike anything Hanover County had ever assembled. Every person who knew Rebecca was interviewed. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, former classmates, her fiancé, ex-boyfriends, delivery drivers, gas station attendants, hunters, truck drivers. More than 400 interviews filled dozens of filing cabinets. Everyone had theories. Nobody had proof. One witness remembered seeing a dark pickup truck parked near Blackwater Creek. Another insisted Rebecca argued with an unidentified man outside the library days before she disappeared. A waitress claimed she overheard two strangers discussing a girl who knew too much. Every statement sounded important. None could be verified. Physical evidence proved equally frustrating. Investigators recovered several unidentified hairs from Rebecca's coat, a partial boot impression near the creek, tiny fibers trapped beneath one fingernail, several cigarette butts scattered near the abandoned access road. In 1983, forensic science simply wasn't capable of answering the questions those items carried. The evidence was carefully packaged, labeled, stored, waiting. No one realized those forgotten envelopes would one day solve the entire case. Months became years. The investigation expanded beyond Virginia. Possible sightings arrived from North Carolina, Kentucky, West Virginia, even Texas. Each lead consumed time and hope before collapsing. Rumors spread faster than facts. One local mechanic was accused after refusing a polygraph. A traveling salesman disappeared before investigators could question him again. Rebecca's fiancé became the target of whispers despite repeated alibis. Families stopped speaking to one another. Friendships ended. Trust evaporated. The murder poisoned the town from the inside. Every anniversary reopened old wounds. Every Christmas reminded residents of the woman who never made it home. By 1987, the task force had shrunk from 12 investigators to 3. Funding disappeared. Witnesses moved away. Evidence gathered dust. The media stopped calling. Officially, the investigation remained active. Reality told another story. The file had become a cold case. The thick cardboard boxes containing Rebecca Lawson's life were moved into the basement archive of the sheriff's office. Shelves filled with forgotten names, forgotten faces, forgotten promises. Only one detective refused to let the case disappear. His name was Thomas Granger. He had been 33 years old when Rebecca vanished. By the time the investigation went cold, gray streaks had already appeared in his hair. He carried photocopies of the case file inside the trunk of his car. He reread witness interviews during lunch breaks. He visited Blackwater Creek every December. Not because he expected to find new evidence, because he refused to forget. People called him obsessed. Maybe they were right. But Granger believed something simple. Murders do not solve themselves. Someone always knows. Someone always remembers. Someone eventually makes a mistake. For nearly 20 years, nothing changed. Then, in 2002, Detective Granger retired. Before leaving the sheriff's office, he carried Rebecca's original case file into the office of a young investigator named Sarah Whitmore. She had grown up hearing stories about the murder. She remembered candlelight vigils, missing posters fading inside grocery store windows, Parents locking doors earlier than before. Granger placed the heavy file on her desk. The answers are in there, he quietly said. We just don't know which pages we're reading wrong. Those words stayed with Sarah long after he walked away. Years passed. Technology transformed criminal investigations. DNA databases expanded. Digital evidence replaced handwritten notes. Cold case units began reopening murders once believed impossible to solve. Rebecca Lawson's file remained untouched. Not because investigators had stopped caring. Because newer crimes demanded immediate attention. The dead waited while the living called first. Then came the phone call.
January.
2:17 a.m. More than 40 years after Rebecca disappeared. One anonymous sentence. You buried the wrong man. The dispatcher nearly ignored it. But protocol required every tip connected to an open homicide be forwarded to detectives. By sunrise, Sarah Whitmore, now leading Hanover County's cold case unit, was reading the transcript. She read it once. Then again. One sentence refused to leave her mind. Check the old Miller farm. Most people no longer remembered the Miller property. An abandoned farmhouse, less than 2 miles from Blackwater Creek. It had been searched briefly in 1983. Nothing significant had been found. Or so everyone believed. Sarah closed the file, looked toward the evidence vault, then glanced once more at the anonymous tip. Outside her office window, snow began falling. The same silent snowfall that had blanketed Hanover County on the night Rebecca Lawson disappeared more than 4 decades earlier. And for the first time in years, the cold case that everyone believed had surrendered its last secret seemed to breathe again. Sarah Whitmore stood motionless for several seconds, staring at the transcript lying across her desk. The anonymous caller had spoken only 23 words, yet those words carried enough weight to awaken a case that had slept beneath layers of dust for more than 40 years. You buried the wrong man. The real one still lives near Blackwater Creek. Check the old Miller farm. You'll find what everyone missed. Most anonymous tips ended exactly where they began. In disappointment. In dead ends. In another folder marked unverified information. This one felt different. Not because it named a suspect. It didn't. Not because it described the crime. It didn't do that either. It pointed investigators toward a place that had already been searched once. That detail bothered Sarah more than anything else. People who invent stories usually direct police somewhere new. Whoever made this call wanted detectives to return to somewhere they had already looked. That suggested only 2 possibilities. The caller knew something investigators had overlooked, or the caller had been there. By 8 o'clock that morning, Sarah had assembled a small cold case review team. 5 investigators. 1 forensic archaeologist. 1 crime scene reconstruction specialist. 2 evidence technicians. No media. No public announcement. If the call turned out to be another hoax, nobody outside the department would ever know. The convoy reached the abandoned Miller farm shortly before noon. Time had nearly erased it. The wooden farmhouse leaned dangerously toward one side. Broken windows stared across empty fields. A rusted tractor sat half swallowed by weeds. The old barn had collapsed years earlier beneath heavy snow. Nature had reclaimed almost everything. Only the silence remained unchanged. Sarah carried photocopies of the original search report from February 1984. The document covered only 4 pages. Investigators had searched the house,
The barn.
the nearby well. Nothing suspicious. Search completed in less than 3 hours. No excavation. No ground-penetrating radar. No forensic soil analysis. In 1984, they simply hadn't possessed the equipment available today. The forensic archaeologist slowly walked the property without speaking. He watched the landscape instead of the buildings, the slope of the ground, the drainage patterns. The way vegetation grew differently across certain sections. After 20 minutes, he stopped near what looked like an ordinary patch of earth beside a line of old cedar trees. Something disturbed this area years ago, he quietly said. It settled differently than the surrounding soil. Ground-penetrating radar was unloaded from the truck. The operator guided the equipment across the field. Back. Forward. Again. The monitor displayed only natural rock formations. Then, near the cedar trees, an unusual rectangular disturbance appeared nearly 4 feet beneath the surface. Not large enough for a body. Too regular to be natural. Sarah felt her heartbeat quicken. Excavation began immediately. Every layer of soil was photographed, measured, documented. 2 hours later, one investigator uncovered the corner of a rusted metal container. Not a coffin. Not human remains. An old military surplus ammunition box. Its lid had nearly fused shut from decades underground. Evidence technicians carefully forced it open. Inside were newspaper clippings, several yellowed photographs, a broken wristwatch, a woman's silver necklace, and a folded blue scarf stained with what appeared to be dried blood. Nobody spoke. Sarah recognized the necklace immediately. Rebecca Lawson's mother had described it during her first interview in December 1983. A Christmas gift. Never recovered. The scarf had never been listed among Rebecca's belongings. The photographs showed something even stranger. Most were ordinary images of Blackwater Creek. Fishing spots, old bridges, country roads. But one picture froze every investigator where they stood. Taken from inside a vehicle. Rebecca's blue Chevrolet Malibu, parked outside the county library. The date stamp in the corner read, December 19th, 1983, the day she disappeared. Someone had been watching her, long before she vanished. The evidence box was transported under armed escort to the State Forensic Laboratory. News of the discovery remained confidential. If the person connected to the anonymous call was still alive, investigators wanted them to believe nothing had changed. Forensic analysts opened each item separately. The newspaper clippings all covered Rebecca's disappearance. Every article had certain sentences underlined. The photographs contained fingerprints too degraded for comparison. The necklace tested positive for microscopic traces of blood. The scarf became everyone's focus. Modern DNA extraction techniques had advanced dramatically since the evidence was buried. Technicians worked inside sterile laboratories. Hours became days. Days became a week. Then the laboratory director called Sarah personally. We recovered a complete male DNA profile. Silence filled Sarah's office. A complete profile? Complete enough for comparison. The profile was immediately entered into the National DNA Database. Everyone waited. Hours passed. Nothing. No match. The unknown man had never submitted DNA. Never been arrested for a qualifying offense. The trail seemed ready to disappear again. Then another analyst noticed something almost invisible. Dog hair. Several white strands woven into the scarf. At first they seemed meaningless, until one forensic biologist examined them under magnification. Great Pyrenees, a livestock guardian breed rarely kept inside Hanover County during the early 1980s. Sarah requested agricultural records. Only 6 farms within 20 miles had registered Great Pyrenees dogs in 1983. One property immediately caught her attention. The Miller Farm. Records showed the land had been leased during the early 80s by a neighboring cattle rancher named Harold Bennett. Investigators interviewed Bennett years earlier. He claimed he visited the property only occasionally. His statement had never been challenged. He died in 1998. His name had quietly disappeared from the investigation. Sarah reopened his file. Everything seemed ordinary, until she reached an interview transcript from January 1984. One sentence had been circled by Detective Thomas Granger decades earlier. Mr. Bennett states he never entered the abandoned farmhouse. Sarah compared it with property maintenance records obtained that afternoon. Bennett had paid to repair the farmhouse roof twice in 1983. He obviously entered the building. Why lie? The question reopened an entirely forgotten path. Investigators turned their attention toward Bennett's family. His wife had passed away years earlier. His son lived 2 counties away. His younger brother still owned farmland less than 3 miles from Blackwater Creek. None had criminal records. None had ever become suspects. Detectives interviewed Bennett's son first. He seemed genuinely surprised, then uncomfortable. When asked about the Miller farm, he hesitated only briefly. My father hated that place. Why? He said bad memories lived there. What kind of memories? He never explained. The interview continued for nearly 3 hours. Nothing directly connected Harold Bennett to Rebecca Lawson's murder. But small inconsistencies emerged. Bennett's son remembered his father suddenly selling all 6 Great Pyrenees dogs during the spring of 1984. No explanation. No financial reason. Just gone. Investigators found another forgotten detail. Vehicle registration records. Harold Bennett owned a dark green Ford pickup during December 1983. Witnesses originally described a dark pickup parked near Blackwater Creek. At the time, investigators identified more than 80 similar trucks. The lead disappeared beneath volume. Today, only one belonged to someone connected with the Miller property. Sarah visited Detective Granger's retirement home that evening. He listened quietly as she described the evidence box. The scarf. The photographs. The DNA. The old cattle rancher. Granger never interrupted. When she finished, the retired detective slowly stood and disappeared into another room. He returned carrying a weathered notebook. My personal notes, he explained. They never made it into the official reports. Sarah carefully opened the first page. Every margin contained observations, questions, names, ideas that couldn't be proven. Halfway through the notebook, she stopped. One paragraph had been written entirely in capital letters. Bennett knows more than he admits. Watch his brother. Sarah looked up. Why wasn't this investigated?
Kana site.
I asked for search warrants. What happened? No probable cause. You were certain? I was suspicious. That's different. He nodded. Back then, suspicion wasn't enough. Sarah continued reading. The final entry about Bennett had been written only weeks before Granger retired. If this case is ever reopened, start at the Miller farm. She closed the notebook slowly. The room fell silent. Outside, evening snow drifted across the old detective's front yard, exactly as it had on the night Rebecca Lawson disappeared. Sarah finally understood something that had haunted investigators for 42 years. The anonymous caller had not given them a new mystery. The caller had pointed them back toward the mystery they almost solved decades earlier. And somewhere beyond Blackwater Creek, someone who had protected that secret for over 40 years was beginning to realize that the silence surrounding Rebecca Lawson's murder had finally begun to collapse. The realization spread through the task force without anyone saying it aloud. Someone had watched the investigation for decades. Not casually.
Closely.
The anonymous caller had known about the Miller farm before the evidence box was discovered. That meant one thing. Whoever made the call either buried the evidence or knew who did. Sarah ordered every recording from the emergency dispatch center to be enhanced. The original audio was nearly unusable. Static. Electrical interference. The faint hum of what sounded like an old payphone. Forensic audio specialists cleaned the recording frame by frame, removing background noise, separating frequencies, searching for anything the human ear had missed. The voice remained distorted.
Age.
Distance. Fear. Or perhaps deliberate disguise. But another sound slowly emerged beneath the static. A train horn.
Long. Low.
Followed 17 seconds later by the crossing bells. Investigators froze. Only 2 active railroad crossings in Hanover County matched that timing in relation to nearby payphones. One had been removed in the early 1990s. The other still stood beside an aging convenience store just outside the town of Ashland. Detectives pulled security footage. The cameras had captured dozens of vehicles during the early morning hours. Most were impossible to identify because of heavy snowfall. Then an analyst noticed an older white sedan entering the parking lot at exactly 2:11 a.m. It remained for less than 2 minutes. Long enough for a phone call. The license plate was unreadable. But something else wasn't. A cracked left taillight covered with red tape. Investigators searched decades of local vehicle registrations. Thousands of records. hundreds of repair reports, insurance photographs, old inspection files. After nearly 4 days, only 4 vehicles in Central Virginia matched that unique repair during the previous year. 3 owners were quickly eliminated. The 4th belonged to a 78-year-old man living less than 5 miles from Blackwater Creek. His name was Samuel Bennett, Harold Bennett's younger brother. The same man Detective Thomas Granger had circled inside his notebook 40 years earlier. Sarah read Samuel's original interview transcript again. He had spoken with deputies only once. 43 minutes. No attorney. No follow-up interview. He claimed he had spent the evening repairing farm equipment. No witness confirmed the statement. At the time, detectives focused on Harold because he leased the Miller property. Samuel quietly disappeared into the background, exactly where he remained for 4 decades. Investigators began reconstructing Samuel Bennett's life. Employment records, property transactions, telephone bills preserved on microfilm, old tax filings. Everything. A pattern slowly emerged. Samuel rarely stayed in one place for long. He worked seasonal construction jobs across Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, always returning home during winter, always avoiding long-term relationships, always keeping to himself. Neighbors described him with nearly identical words: quiet, polite, forgettable. One elderly resident offered something unexpected. He drove out to Blackwater Creek every Christmas. Sarah leaned forward. Every Christmas? The woman nodded slowly. I thought he was visiting someone's grave. There isn't a cemetery there. I know. The answer lingered in the room long after the interview ended. Why return every December? Guilt? Habit? Memory? Or fear that something remained hidden? A surveillance team quietly monitored Samuel's farmhouse.
No flashing lights.
No marked vehicles. Only patient observation. For 6 days, nothing unusual happened. He fed livestock, collected mail, visited a hardware store, returned home.
Routine.
Predictable. Then, shortly after sunset on the 7th day, Samuel climbed into an old pickup truck and drove toward Blackwater Creek. Investigators followed from a distance. Snow drifted across the empty roads. The same winding highway Rebecca Lawson had driven decades earlier. Samuel parked near the abandoned access road. He remained inside the truck for almost 20 minutes, not moving, simply staring toward the frozen creek. Then he stepped outside carrying a flashlight. He walked slowly to the water's edge.
Stopped.
Removed something from his coat pocket and threw it into the darkness. The surveillance team waited until he left. Evidence technicians searched the area using powerful lights. Within minutes, one investigator found a small metal object resting against the frozen shoreline.
A key. Old.
Rusted. Attached to a faded blue plastic tag. Stamped into the metal were 4 worn letters. RLL. Rebecca Lawson Library. Sarah immediately contacted county archives. Library maintenance records from 1983 listed only one missing key after Rebecca disappeared. The master storage room key. Never recovered. The discovery transformed surveillance into probable cause. Search warrants were signed before dawn. Samuel Bennett's farmhouse became the center of the largest evidence operation Hanover County had conducted in decades. Investigators photographed every room, every cabinet, every drawer,
every box stored inside the attic.
Hours passed with little progress. Then an evidence technician opened an old cedar chest hidden beneath blankets. Inside were dozens of notebooks, weather journals, farm records, expense ledgers. Perfectly ordinary, until the final notebook. Unlike the others, it contained no farming information, only dates, locations, weather conditions, and names. Some names were crossed out, others circled. Rebecca Lawson's name appeared only once. December 19th, 1983. Beside it were 4 words written in shaky handwriting. She wasn't supposed to scream. Nobody spoke. The notebook was sealed immediately. Fingerprints, DNA, ink analysis. Everything would be examined. Sarah remained in the attic after everyone else descended. She continued searching. Old investigators often said offenders rarely kept only one secret. If this notebook existed, something else probably did too. Behind the cedar chest, she noticed fresh nail heads securing one section of wall paneling.
Fresh.
Compared to the surrounding wood, she tapped the boards.
Solid.
Except for one section. A hollow echo answered. The panel was carefully removed. Hidden inside the narrow space rested a long cardboard tube wrapped in plastic. Inside the tube, rolled tightly together, were 23 undeveloped camera negatives. The county crime laboratory rushed them for processing. Hours later, the first images slowly appeared inside the darkroom. Investigators watched in complete silence. The earliest photographs showed Blackwater Creek during different seasons. Bridges,
Roads.
trees. Nothing unusual. Then the sequence changed. Rebecca Lawson leaving the library. Rebecca unlocking her car. Rebecca buying coffee 2 days before her disappearance. Rebecca speaking with her fiancé outside church. She had been photographed repeatedly. Weeks before the murder. Someone had stalked her. Methodically. Patiently. The final frame stopped everyone in the room. It showed Rebecca standing beside her Chevrolet on the night she disappeared. She wasn't alone. A man stood only a few feet away. His face was partially hidden by falling snow. But enough remained visible. Enough for modern forensic imaging. Enough for hope. Enough to suggest that after 42 years, Rebecca Lawson's killer might finally have been captured on film without ever realizing it. The photograph was rushed to the Virginia State Forensic Imaging Laboratory before sunrise. No one touched the original negative. It was sealed inside a climate-controlled evidence container and transported under chain-of-custody procedures that had become far stricter than anything investigators could have imagined in 1983. Inside the imaging lab, technicians scanned the negative at an ultra-high resolution. One pass, then another. Every grain of film was magnified. Every imperfection mapped. The snow that once concealed details could now be digitally separated from the background. Contrast shifted. Exposure adjusted. Light balanced. The blurred silhouette slowly began to sharpen. A heavy winter coat. A knit cap pulled low over the forehead. Work boots. Gloves. The man's face remained partially obscured, but one detail immediately stood out. A long scar running from the corner of the left eye toward the cheek. Sarah stared at the enlarged image. She had seen that scar before. Not in person. In an old driver's license photograph. Samuel Bennett. She opened his personnel file again. The scar had been noted in a hospital report from 1976 after a farming accident involving barbed wire. The angle matched perfectly. The location matched. But a photograph alone would never be enough. Not after 42 years. They needed something stronger. Something impossible to explain away. The notebook. The photographs. The buried evidence. The library key. Each piece pointed toward Samuel. Yet prosecutors demanded what every homicide case required.
A chain.
One continuous chain connecting every fact. No gaps. No assumptions. No speculation. The forensic team returned to the scarf recovered from the ammunition box. Technology had advanced again since the first DNA extraction only weeks earlier. This time, analysts focused on microscopic skin cells trapped beneath dried blood. The process was painfully slow. Contamination checks. Replicated testing. Independent verification. Days passed. Sarah barely slept. Every morning she called the laboratory. Every afternoon the answer remained the same. We're still processing. Meanwhile, detectives quietly interviewed people who had known Samuel Bennett decades earlier. Most struggled to remember details. Time had stolen memories. But not all of them. An 86-year-old retired mechanic recalled repairing Samuel's pickup truck shortly after Christmas in 1983. He wanted the passenger side mirror replaced. Why? Said he hit a tree. The mechanic frowned. But I remember thinking it was strange. Why strange? The mirror wasn't broken from a tree. Sarah leaned forward. How could you tell? I've fixed trucks my whole life.
He paused.
It looked like someone grabbed it and ripped it backward. A struggle, perhaps, or someone desperately trying to escape. The old repair invoice still existed, folded inside a metal filing cabinet that had survived 4 decades. A fingerprint dusting revealed nothing useful, but traces of dark blue automotive paint remained trapped beneath old grease. Investigators compared the sample to microscopic paint flakes collected from Rebecca's Chevrolet in 1983. The chemistry matched. The manufacturer matched. The production year matched. For the first time, Samuel Bennett's truck could be physically linked to Rebecca's vehicle.
Still,
Sarah wanted more. She visited Rebecca's younger sister, Claire. The two women sat in a quiet living room filled with family photographs. Pictures of birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings frozen in happier times. Claire opened an old cedar box. I've never shown these to anyone. Inside were Rebecca's personal letters, birthday cards, receipts, a small appointment calendar. Sarah carefully turned each page. Most entries described ordinary life, work, dinner plans, church choir practice. Then she reached December, 3 days before Rebecca disappeared. One sentence written in hurried handwriting caught her attention. Blue truck again. Same man watching. Tell Tom if it happens tomorrow. Sarah's heart pounded.
Tom.
Detective Thomas Granger. Rebecca had intended to report being followed, but she never got the chance. Granger searched his retired files after Sarah called. Late that evening, he found an envelope tucked inside an old storage box. Unopened.
Addressed to him.
Postmarked December 20th, 1983. The day after Rebecca vanished. Somehow it had been mixed into unrelated paperwork and never delivered. Inside was a handwritten note from Rebecca's library supervisor. Rebecca asked me yesterday if I knew who owned the green pickup parked across the street every afternoon. She said the driver watched the library, but never came inside. Sarah closed her eyes. The warning had existed all along, buried beneath paperwork. Forgotten. Another overlooked detail. Another missed opportunity. By the end of the week, the laboratory finally called. The lead forensic scientist spoke only one sentence. We have a direct DNA comparison. Sarah drove to Richmond immediately. The scientist placed 2 reports on the conference table. One profile came from skin cells recovered on the scarf. The second came from a drinking glass collected during surveillance at Samuel Bennett's farmhouse. The statistical probability of another individual sharing the same profile was effectively impossible. Samuel Bennett's DNA was on the scarf buried beside Rebecca Lawson's necklace. The room remained silent, not because anyone doubted the result, because after 42 years, they finally held scientific proof. Search warrants quickly expanded. Excavators returned to Samuel's property. This time investigators searched beneath an aging equipment shed built in the summer of 1984. Ground-penetrating radar detected another anomaly. Workers carefully removed the concrete floor. Below it lay a narrow cavity sealed with wooden planks. Inside were burned fragments of clothing, rusted jewelry, a broken flashlight, and something investigators had searched for since December 1983. Rebecca Lawson's missing leather handbag. Its contents had largely decomposed, but one object survived. A disposable camera. The film inside had never been developed. Technicians handled it with extraordinary care. Against all expectations, several images remained recoverable. Most were ordinary holiday photographs taken before Rebecca disappeared. Friends laughing inside the library. Christmas decorations. Snow-covered streets. Then came the final exposure. Accidental.
Blurry.
Taken sideways. Perhaps while the camera fell. It showed the interior of a pickup truck. The steering wheel. The dashboard. And a driver's hand gripping the wheel. Across the back of that hand, the same jagged scar visible in the surveillance photograph. One photograph could be challenged. 2 independent photographs taken years apart, combined with DNA, the buried evidence, the notebook, the library key, and decades of overlooked clues. formed a chain too strong to break. Late that afternoon, Sarah stood outside Samuel Bennett's farmhouse as marked patrol cars rolled quietly into the driveway. The old man stepped onto his porch before anyone reached the front steps. He looked at the detectives, then at the snow falling across his fields. His shoulders slowly sank, as though he had been expecting this moment for years. Sarah stopped a few feet away. She never raised her voice. She never accused him. She simply held up the evidence photograph recovered from the camera. Samuel stared at it for a long time. Then he whispered 5 words almost too softly to hear. "I knew she'd kept it." No one spoke. The silence lasted only seconds, but it carried 42 years of buried truth. Samuel Bennett never tried to run. He never asked why the detectives were there. He never demanded a lawyer. Instead, he looked past the patrol cars toward the snow-covered fields stretching behind his farmhouse. The same fields he had walked every winter for decades. The same fields that had hidden his secret. A deputy stepped forward and quietly informed him he was under arrest for the murder of Rebecca Lawson. Samuel nodded once, almost as if he had rehearsed that moment in his mind for years. The handcuffs clicked shut. The sound echoed across the frozen yard. No shouting. No struggle. Only silence. As investigators searched the farmhouse one final time, Sarah remained on the porch. She watched Samuel being placed inside the back of a sheriff's vehicle. He never looked at her. He kept staring toward Blackwater Creek, toward the place where everything had begun. Inside the interview room, the atmosphere felt strangely calm. A recorder sat in the center of the metal table. The red light blinked. Samuel folded his hands. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Sarah finally broke the silence. "Who made the anonymous phone call?" Samuel looked down. "It wasn't me." "Do you know who did?"
No.
"You expect us to believe that?" "I've wondered every day." The answer caught everyone off guard. Sarah slid the recovered notebook across the table. The page containing the words she wasn't supposed to scream remained visible. Samuel stared at the handwriting for a long time. Then he quietly nodded. "I wrote it." "Why?" "So I wouldn't forget." "You remembered for 42 years. I remembered every day." The room fell silent again. Sarah opened another evidence envelope. Inside lay the silver necklace recovered from the ammunition box. Samuel's expression changed immediately. Regret, fear, or exhaustion. Perhaps all 3. He closed his eyes. "I should have burned everything." Sarah leaned forward. "But you didn't." "No." "Why?" Samuel took a slow breath. "Because every time I tried." His voice cracked for the first time. "That I saw her face." Investigators continued carefully. "What happened that night?" Samuel remained quiet. Almost 2 minutes passed before he answered. "I followed her." "Why?" "I'd been watching her for weeks." "What did you want?" "I don't know anymore." "Did you know her?" "No." "Had you ever spoken to her?"
No.
"Then why follow her?" Another long silence. "I imagined she knew me." Sarah recognized the pattern immediately. Obsession. Fantasy. Delusion slowly replacing reality. A dangerous combination that investigators in 1983 barely understood. Samuel continued speaking without being prompted. "I parked outside the library every afternoon. I watched her leave. I knew which road she took home. I knew what time she locked the doors." Every sentence deepened the horror. Rebecca had never known she was being studied. Her ordinary routine had become someone else's ritual. What happened on December 19th? Samuel swallowed. "I pulled beside her near Blackwater Creek." "What did you say?" "I asked if her car was having trouble." "It wasn't." "I know." "Why did she stop?" "I think."
He paused.
"That because people trusted each other back then." The room became unbearably quiet. No one interrupted. No one rushed him. He continued in a voice barely above a whisper. She realized something was wrong. She tried to get back into her car. She screamed. His hands began shaking. I panicked. What happened next? I hit her. With what? A flashlight. The very flashlight investigators had recovered beneath the equipment shed only days earlier. I didn't mean... He stopped. The sentence remained unfinished, because there were no words capable of changing what followed. Sarah asked only one more question. Why bury the evidence at the Miller farm? Samuel looked toward the interview room window. My brother told me nobody would ever search there again. The statement immediately changed the direction of the investigation. Harold Bennett, dead for more than 20 years. Had he helped cover up the crime? Or had he only discovered the truth afterward? Investigators compared Samuel's confession with Harold's old statements. The inconsistencies suddenly made sense.
Harold had lied.
Not because he committed the murder, because he protected his younger brother. Property records, repair invoices, the buried ammunition box. Everything aligned. Harold had hidden the evidence. Samuel had committed the murder. 2 brothers. One crime. One covering for the other. One carrying the secret to his grave. Sarah thought back to Detective Thomas Granger's notebook. Bennett knows more than he admits. Watch his brother. He had been right. 40 years earlier. He simply lacked the evidence to prove it. When news of the arrest became public, Hanover County stopped. Local television interrupted regular programming. Newspapers rushed out special editions. Residents gathered outside cafes, hardware stores, and churches, speaking in hushed voices. Many refused to believe it. Samuel Bennett? The quiet farmer? The man who rarely missed Sunday service? The neighbor who helped repair fences after storms? It didn't seem possible. But evil rarely announces itself. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it waves from across the road. Sometimes it spends decades pretending to be ordinary. Rebecca Lawson's family learned about the arrest from Sarah personally. She drove to the small brick house where Rebecca's younger sister, Claire, still lived. Claire opened the door before Sarah reached the porch. One look was enough. She already knew. Sarah didn't begin with evidence. She didn't begin with the confession. She simply said 4 words. We found the truth. Claire covered her face. Neither woman spoke. Years of waiting. Years of wondering. Years of imagining every possible ending. All collapsed into one overwhelming moment. Inside the house, Rebecca's parents were gone. Both had passed away years earlier without knowing what had happened to their daughter. Their framed photographs rested on a shelf beside Rebecca's smiling graduation picture. Sarah looked at the 3 photographs together. One family. 3 lives forever shaped by one winter night. Claire quietly touched Rebecca's picture. They waited their whole lives. Sarah nodded. I'm sorry. So am I. Outside, church bells echoed through Hanover County. Snow continued falling across Blackwater Creek, covering old roads, old memories, old secrets. But not this time. This time, the truth had finally found its way home. The confession traveled across Virginia faster than the snowstorm that settled over Hanover County that week. National news outlets picked up the story before sunrise. 1983 Virginia cold case solved after 4 decades. Anonymous tip leads detectives to long-hidden evidence. DNA confirms identity of suspect in Christmas murder. For many people, it was another headline. For Hanover County, it was the ending of a chapter that had shaped an entire generation. Reporters crowded outside the sheriff's office. Satellite trucks lined the courthouse square. Microphones stretched toward anyone willing to speak. Most residents simply shook their heads. They had lived beside Samuel Bennett for decades. Some had borrowed his tools. Some had shared meals with him at church picnics. Others had trusted him enough to leave him alone in their homes. Now, every memory felt different. Every ordinary conversation carried a darker meaning. The sheriff's office released only the facts supported by evidence. The recovered ammunition box, the buried necklace, the notebook, the photographs, the DNA match, the confession. Investigators deliberately withheld one detail: the anonymous phone call. Its origin remained unknown. Only a handful of detectives knew about it. Sarah insisted the information stay confidential. Someone had taken an enormous risk to reopen the investigation. Until they understood who that person was, they would protect that secret. The question refused to disappear. Who had called at 2:17 that morning? The voice belonged neither to Samuel Bennett nor to anyone investigators immediately recognized. Telephone company records revealed only that the call came from the payphone outside the convenience store near Ashland.
No fingerprints.
No usable surveillance image. Nothing. It was as though the caller had appeared for 1 minute, changed history, and vanished again. The mystery lingered even as prosecutors prepared for trial. Although Samuel had confessed, investigators continued verifying every statement independently. A confession alone was never enough. Every detail had to match physical evidence.
It did.
He accurately described the flashlight later recovered beneath the equipment shed. He remembered where Rebecca's handbag had been hidden. He explained why the library key ended up near Blackwater Creek. Most importantly, his timeline aligned perfectly with forensic evidence collected more than 40 years apart. The prosecution's case became overwhelming. Yet one question remained unanswered. Why had Samuel kept the evidence? During a second interview, Sarah asked him directly, "You had decades to destroy everything." Samuel stared at the tabletop. "I tried." "What stopped you?" "I thought if I buried it,"
He paused.
"it would stay buried inside me too." It didn't.
No.
Why not? Because every Christmas. He looked toward the interview room window. I heard her screaming again. For the first time since his arrest, Sarah saw something beyond fear. She saw a man who had never escaped the consequences of his own actions. Not legally. Not until now. But psychologically. His prison had existed long before the courtroom. It had simply been invisible. Detective Thomas Granger attended every day of the trial. He sat quietly in the back row, never seeking attention, never speaking to reporters. He watched witnesses testify. He watched forensic scientists explain DNA sequencing that did not exist when he first investigated the case. He watched enlarged photographs projected across courtroom screens. Technology had finally given a voice to evidence that had remained silent for 42 years. During a recess, a young detective approached him. "You were right all along." Granger smiled sadly.
No.
The detective looked confused. "I was suspicious." He glanced toward the courtroom. "Evidence is what makes you right." The words spread quietly through the department. They became something of a motto inside the cold case unit. Suspicions begin investigations. Evidence finishes them. After only 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent. Samuel Bennett stood without expression. The foreperson unfolded the verdict. Guilty. One word. 42 years in the making. Rebecca Lawson's sister closed her eyes. Tears rolled silently down her face. Not tears of celebration. Justice is never joyful when it arrives so late. They were tears of relief, of exhaustion, of finally reaching the end of a road that had seemed endless. Outside the courthouse, Sarah stood beside Detective Granger. Television cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Neither detective hurried toward the microphones. Instead, they looked across the courthouse lawn where snow was beginning to fall again. Granger quietly laughed. "You know." Sarah looked at him. "I used to come here every December." "I know. I'd drive to Blackwater Creek." He smiled faintly. "I always believed the answer was waiting." Sarah followed his gaze.
It was.
"We just weren't ready to see it." That afternoon, Rebecca Lawson's case file officially changed status. After 42 years, 7 months, and 12 days. The red stamp placed across the front folder contained only one word.
Solved.
The file was moved from the active cold case archive into the historical evidence vault. Not to be forgotten. To be remembered. Because it had become more than a murder investigation. It had become proof that patience, science, and determination could reach across generations. Weeks later, Sarah returned alone to Blackwater Creek. The crime scene tape was gone. The news crews had disappeared. The crowds had moved on. Only the creek remained. Water flowed quietly beneath the old bridge. Snow rested along the banks exactly as it had on the night Rebecca disappeared. Sarah walked to the place where investigators had found the abandoned Chevrolet more than 4 decades earlier. Nothing marked the spot now. Nature had erased every visible trace, but memory had not. She removed a single white rose from her coat, placed it gently beside the creek, and stood in silence. The wind moved softly through the bare trees. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed across the frozen landscape. The same lonely sound captured beneath the anonymous phone call that had reopened everything. Sarah looked toward the empty road. Whoever had made that call had never stepped forward. Perhaps they never would. Perhaps guilt had finally outweighed fear. Perhaps someone had kept a promise made long ago. Or perhaps another secret had died before it could be spoken aloud. She would probably never know. But one truth no longer required guessing. Rebecca Lawson had finally come home. Not in the way her family had prayed for in 1983, but in the only way still possible. With her name restored, with the truth uncovered, with justice, however delayed, finally fulfilled. And as evening settled over Blackwater Creek, the cold December wind carried away the silence that had haunted the valley for more than 4 decades, leaving behind only the story of a young woman who was never forgotten, a detective who never stopped believing, and one anonymous phone call that changed everything. The courthouse emptied before sunset. The television crews folded their tripods. Microphones disappeared into equipment cases. Satellite trucks rolled away one by one. By the following morning, another national story had replaced Rebecca Lawson on the front page. That was the nature of the news. Headlines move on. Families do not. Claire Lawson remained in the courtroom long after everyone else had left. She walked slowly to the witness stand where she had spoken only hours earlier. 42 years. She had spent 42 years imagining this room. Imagining what she would say if the day ever came. Yet when it finally arrived, words felt strangely unnecessary. The verdict had spoken for everyone. Outside, snow drifted across the courthouse steps. She looked toward the parking lot where reporters had gathered all week. Now it was almost empty. Only Detective Sarah Whitmore remained, standing beside her vehicle. Neither woman said anything for several moments. Finally, Claire smiled through tears. My parents would have waited all day just to hear that one word. Sarah nodded quietly. Guilty. Claire looked toward the gray winter sky. They never stopped believing. They helped solve this case. Claire frowned. They've both been gone for years. Sarah shook her head. They kept Rebecca alive. And because they never stopped talking about her. Neither did we. Those words stayed with Claire long after she drove home. Weeks later, the Virginia Department of Forensic Science published an internal case review. It wasn't written for the public. It was written for detectives, laboratory scientists, evidence technicians, every investigator beginning a career in homicide. The report listed dozens of lessons learned from the Rebecca Lawson investigation. Never assume old evidence has lost its value. Re-examine witness statements after technological advances. Preserve every item, no matter how insignificant it appears. Question conclusions, not just evidence. And one sentence appeared alone at the bottom of the final page. Cold cases do not grow weaker with time. Evidence grows stronger. The report circulated through law enforcement agencies across the country. Training academies discussed it. Cold case units requested copies. Rebecca Lawson's name became part of investigative history. Not because her murder had been uniquely brutal, because her case proved something many detectives had always hoped was true. Justice can outlive silence. Months after the conviction, workers began restoring the abandoned Miller farmhouse. Not to erase history,
to document it.
Every room was photographed. Every hidden space mapped. Archaeologists searched the surrounding property one final time. No additional human remains were found. No second crime. Only scattered remnants of ordinary farm life frozen beneath decades of soil. Old horseshoes, rusted tools, broken bottles, objects that had witnessed history without ever speaking. The restored evidence was eventually transferred into climate-controlled storage. Rebecca's necklace, the library key, the disposable camera, the notebook, the scarf. Each item carefully cataloged, each one representing a different piece of the truth. Together, they told a story no witness had ever been able to tell. Detective Thomas Granger attended the dedication of the county's new cold case investigation center the following spring. The building wasn't large, just a renovated brick office beside the sheriff's headquarters. Inside the entrance hung a simple bronze plaque. It read, "Dedicated to every victim whose story is still waiting to be heard." Beneath the inscription appeared a smaller line. "In memory of Rebecca Lawson." Granger stood quietly in front of the plaque. He remembered driving icy roads in 1983. He remembered knocking on doors, searching fields, reading the same witness statements until the pages became soft from use. He remembered going home each Christmas wondering what he had missed. Now he finally knew. It hadn't been one missing clue. It had been one missing generation of science. Sarah joined him after the ceremony. "You were right." Granger smiled gently. "You've already told me that."
No.
She looked toward the plaque. "I mean about something else." "What?" "You said someone always knows." Granger looked down for a moment. "They do. We still don't know who made that phone call." "No. Do you think we ever will?" The retired detective watched snowflakes drifting through the afternoon air. Then he quietly answered, "Maybe we're asking the wrong question." Sarah looked at him. "The important question isn't who called. It's why." She considered the thought. Someone had carried that secret for decades. Someone had finally decided the truth mattered more than silence. Perhaps that person had been a relative, a friend, a neighbor, someone who overheard a confession, someone who discovered an old letter, or perhaps someone whose conscience simply became too heavy to carry any longer. But the decision changed history. Every Christmas Eve, Rebecca's family began placing a single lantern beside Blackwater Creek. Not where she disappeared, not where she was found, but near the bridge she crossed every evening after leaving the library. The lanterns stayed lit until sunrise. No speeches, no ceremony, just a quiet light against the darkness. Within a few years, other residents joined them. One lantern became 10. 10 became 50. Eventually, hundreds of lights lined the roadside each December. People who had never met Rebecca came anyway. Young families, retired deputies, students from the local high school, cold case investigators from neighboring counties. They came because her story reminded them that forgotten does not mean lost, and unanswered does not mean unanswerable. Late one winter evening, long after the crowds had left, Sarah returned to the bridge alone. The lanterns still flickered softly in the cold wind. She leaned against the railing and listened to the water moving beneath the ice. 43 years earlier, investigators had searched this same creek believing the answers were somewhere below its surface. They had been wrong. The answers had never belonged to the water. They had belonged to people, to memory, to evidence, to perseverance. Most of all, they had belonged to time. Because time had not protected the truth. Time had prepared it.
Prepared it for better science.
Prepared it for sharper eyes. Prepared it for one anonymous voice brave enough to break 40 years of silence. The creek flowed quietly into the darkness. The snow continued falling. And somewhere beyond the trees, a freight train sounded its lonely horn as it passed through Hanover County. The same sound captured beneath a frightened whisper at 2:17 in the morning. The same sound that reopened a forgotten file. The same sound that ultimately carried Rebecca Lawson's story from mystery to justice. The cold case was no longer cold. The silence was no longer silent. And the truth, after waiting more than 4 decades for someone willing to hear it, had finally spoken. The years that followed never erased Rebecca Lawson's story. If anything, they made it stronger. Every new detective assigned to Hanover County's cold case unit received the same case file during training. Not because it was the oldest. Not because it had attracted national attention. because it demonstrated the one lesson every homicide investigator eventually learns. A case is only truly unsolvable when people stop asking questions. Rebecca's file became the first one placed on the conference table during orientation. New investigators opened the faded binder expecting to find a story about forensic science. Instead, they discovered something far more important: patience. Every page carried evidence of people who refused to surrender. Deputies who searched frozen woods for weeks. Volunteers who walked miles through snow. Laboratory technicians who preserved tiny fragments of evidence without knowing whether they would ever matter. Detectives who retired without seeing the case solved. Families who continued speaking Rebecca's name when the rest of the country had forgotten it. None of them solved the case alone. Together, they made the solution possible. Sarah Whitmore often reminded young investigators of that fact. "You don't inherit a cold case," she would tell them. "You inherit someone else's promise." Those words spread far beyond Hanover County. Other departments invited Sarah to speak. She never described herself as the detective who solved Rebecca Lawson's murder. Instead, she always credited the investigators who came before her. They found the evidence. They protected it. They kept the file alive. My generation simply had better tools. That humility earned respect across the country. Cold case detectives understood something the public rarely saw. Justice is almost never the work of one brilliant investigator. It is built over decades by people who may never meet each other. One detective collects a fingerprint. Another preserves it. Another sends it for testing 20 years later. A laboratory scientist develops a new method. A prosecutor connects the final pieces. Justice becomes a relay race across generations. Rebecca Lawson's case proved exactly that. Years later, a documentary crew requested permission to film inside the evidence vault. The sheriff approved on one condition: no dramatic recreations. No sensational music. Only the truth. The filmmakers spent hours recording shelves lined with carefully preserved evidence. Thousands of sealed boxes. Thousands of unanswered stories. The camera eventually stopped in front of one shelf. Case number 83 to 417. Rebecca Lawson. The narrator spoke quietly. This box waited 42 years. Nothing more needed to be said. The image alone carried enough weight. Meanwhile, one mystery continued resisting every attempt to solve it. The anonymous caller. Investigators revisited the recording countless times. Voice comparison software. Regional accent analysis. Telephone routing records. Nothing produced a definitive answer. Some believed the caller had been a distant relative of Samuel Bennett. Others suspected an old hunting partner who learned the truth late in life. A few detectives even wondered whether Harold Bennett himself had told someone before he died, asking them to make the call if Samuel never confessed. No theory could be proven. The file remained open. Not the murder. Only the identity of the caller. Sarah eventually stopped trying to solve that mystery. Not because she lost interest, because she realized the caller had already accomplished exactly what they intended. Rebecca finally received justice. Perhaps that was enough. Every December 19th, the county library closed 1 hour early. Employees gathered in the front lobby beside Rebecca's framed photograph. No speeches. No media. Only a minute of silence. Then one librarian quietly locked the front door at exactly 6 o'clock. The same time Rebecca had locked it on her final evening. Outside, a single white candle was placed beneath the library sign. By morning, someone had almost always left fresh flowers beside it. No one ever admitted who. No one needed to. Memory often speaks without names. On the 40th anniversary of Rebecca's disappearance, a local elementary school asked Sarah to address a classroom. One child raised a hand. Why didn't people give up? The room became very still. Then she smiled gently. Because someone was waiting for us. The children looked confused. Sarah continued. Every victim waits for someone to finish telling their story. That answer remained with many of those students long after the lesson ended. Some would later become police officers. some forensic scientists, some attorneys. Rebecca Lawson's story quietly shaped futures she would never know. Late one winter afternoon, years after retiring, Sarah drove alone to Blackwater Creek. The bridge looked almost unchanged. The water still moved slowly beneath the ice. Snow still settled across the fields in perfect silence. She walked to the railing and rested her hands against the cold metal. She wasn't there to investigate. There were no unanswered questions left. She came simply to remember. A freight train sounded in the distance. Its horn echoed across the valley exactly as it had on that anonymous recording decades earlier. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, not thinking about evidence, not thinking about courtrooms, only thinking about Rebecca, a young librarian leaving work before Christmas, planning tomorrow without realizing tomorrow would never come. One ordinary evening, one ordinary drive home, one ordinary act of trusting another human being. History often changes through extraordinary events. Sometimes it changes through painfully ordinary ones. As the sun disappeared behind the Virginia hills, Sarah placed one final white rose beside the creek. She stood there until the last light faded from the snow. Then she turned toward her car. Behind her, Blackwater Creek continued flowing quietly through the winter landscape, no longer carrying a mystery, but carrying something far more powerful, the enduring proof that truth can be delayed, buried, ignored, and nearly forgotten, yet it can never be erased as long as someone is willing to keep searching, keep believing, and keep one small light burning against the darkness until justice finally finds its way home. The first winter after the trial arrived quietly. No television trucks returned to Hanover County. No reporters waited outside the sheriff's office. The crowds that once gathered near Blackwater Creek had long since disappeared, leaving behind only the ordinary sounds of a small Virginia town settling into another cold season. Yet on the night of December 19th, lanterns began appearing along the roadside one by one. A farmer placed the first near the old bridge. A retired deputy added another beside the creek bank. By midnight, dozens of small lights stretched through the darkness, flickering against the snow as if the road itself had become a memorial. Sarah Whitmore parked several hundred yards away and walked the final distance alone. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke. Ice cracked softly along the edge of the water. She stopped at the center of the bridge, where Rebecca Lawson would have driven 43 years earlier, carrying library books on the passenger seat and thinking about Christmas only 6 days away. Sarah rested her gloved hands on the cold railing and listened to the creek moving beneath the ice. 4 months after the conviction, she had been asked the same question by reporters, prosecutors, and young detectives. What solved the case? The easy answer was DNA. The accurate answer was much longer. A dispatcher who forwarded an anonymous tip instead of dismissing it. An evidence technician who preserved a stained scarf in 1984. A retired detective who wrote a warning in the margin of a notebook. A sister who kept old letters in a cedar box. A laboratory scientist who looked closely enough to notice dog hair woven into the fabric. A dozen people, separated by decades, unknowingly handing the truth to one another until it finally reached the surface. Snow drifted across the bridge in slow spirals. Sarah thought about Samuel Bennett sitting in a prison cell only 70 miles away. During his final interview before sentencing, he had asked a question that still unsettled her. Did she suffer long? Sarah had answered with the truth.
No.
He closed his eyes and whispered, "That's the only mercy I have left." For a moment she had seen not the monster described in newspaper headlines, but an old man crushed beneath the weight of a secret he had carried for most of his life. The feeling passed quickly. Regret did not erase murder. Guilt did not restore a stolen future. But it reminded her that evil rarely looks dramatic from the inside. Sometimes it looks like an ordinary person making one catastrophic choice and spending the next 40 years trying unsuccessfully to bury the echo of that moment. A train horn sounded in the distance, low and mournful, rolling across the valley exactly as it had on the anonymous recording. Sarah turned toward the sound. The identity of the caller remained the only open question connected to Rebecca's case. The investigation had been suspended, not closed. Every few months, someone in the department reopened the audio file and listened again, hoping a new technology or a fresh ear might reveal what decades of analysis had not. Sarah had stopped expecting an answer. Some mysteries survive because they are the price of finally solving a larger one. Whoever made that call had chosen anonymity over recognition, and perhaps that decision deserved respect. The caller had not sought credit. The caller had sought justice. Footsteps approached behind her. Claire Lawson emerged from the darkness, carrying a small brass lantern. She set it carefully on the railing beside Sarah. "My mother used to say Rebecca was afraid of the dark," Claire said softly. "Not terrified. She just liked having a light nearby." The lantern flame reflected in the black water below. "I used to imagine her out there somewhere," Claire continued, looking toward the creek. "For years I'd hear a phone ring and think maybe she'd found a way home." Sarah remained silent. Some grief does not need answers. It only needs a witness. Claire touched the lantern's warm metal frame. "The strangest part is that I don't think about the murder anymore. I think about the last ordinary day she had." She smiled faintly. She borrowed a cookbook from the library and promised to make pecan pie for Christmas dinner. We found the recipe card still tucked inside the book. The image struck Sarah harder than any crime scene photograph. A recipe card, a pie that was never baked. The future, interrupted by a single violent moment. They stood together without speaking as snow settled on their coats. Down the road, more lanterns glowed through the trees. The entire creek valley seemed threaded with small, stubborn lights. Eventually, Claire turned to leave. After a few steps, she looked back. "Thank you for not letting her become a file." When she disappeared into the darkness, Sarah remained on the bridge a little longer. She thought about Detective Thomas Granger, who had died before seeing the second anniversary of the conviction. At his funeral, the sheriff had placed Granger's weathered notebook on the altar beside his badge. The final page bore Sarah's handwritten line beneath his old warning about the Miller farm. "You were right to keep believing." The notebook now rested in the county archives, protected behind glass. Young detectives studied it during training, tracing the faded pencil marks left by a man who had spent decades chasing a truth he could not yet prove. Sarah hoped they understood the real lesson hidden in those pages. Persistence is not stubbornness. Persistence is faith that evidence can still speak, even when years of silence suggest otherwise. The wind strengthened, sending ripples across the lantern flame. Sarah picked up the white rose she had brought and laid it gently on the railing. For a moment it rested there, bright against the dark metal, before the wind carried a few petals onto the creek below. They drifted away slowly, turning in the current like small fragments of snow. Another train horn echoed across the valley, fading into the winter night. Sarah listened until the sound disappeared completely. Then she looked once more at the lanterns stretching along the road, each one a quiet promise that Rebecca Lawson had not been forgotten. The creek flowed on beneath the ice, indifferent to the years, the headlines, and the grief that had gathered along its banks. But the silence that once haunted Blackwater Creek was gone. In its place remained something steadier, the knowledge that truth can be delayed, buried, overlooked, and nearly lost, yet it survives in the smallest traces until someone is willing to follow those traces all the way through the darkness and into the light. Spring arrived slowly in Hanover County. The snow melted from the shoulders of old country roads. Blackwater Creek swelled with rainwater, carrying branches and broken ice downstream. Wildflowers pushed through the ground where search teams had once stood shoulder to shoulder, calling Rebecca Lawson's name into the darkness. Life always found a way to continue. People returned to work. Children rode bicycles again. Farmers repaired fences damaged by winter storms. The town looked almost identical to the place it had been before December 19th, 1983. Almost. Because some places never completely heal. Sarah Whitmore officially closed her office late one Friday evening. Rebecca's file had finally been transferred into the Historical Homicide Archive, sealed inside a climate-controlled cabinet reserved for landmark investigations. She ran her fingers across the faded cardboard cover one last time. Case number 83 to 417. Rebecca Lawson.
Closed.
The word still felt unfamiliar. For 42 years, detectives had opened that file searching for answers. Now there were none left to chase. Only history remained. As Sarah turned away, a young detective named Michael Evans entered the archive carrying another stack of forgotten case files. "You heading home?" he asked. Sarah smiled. "I think so." Michael hesitated. "I've been reading Granger's notebook." Sarah looked back. "What do you think?" He never gave up.
No.
"I don't know if I could have waited 40 years. Sarah considered the question before answering. "You don't wait 40 years. He frowned. "You work one day. Then another. Then another. One day you realize 40 years have passed." Michael nodded quietly. That answer stayed with him long after Sarah left the building. Months later, he would reopen another forgotten homicide from 1986. Not because he expected success, because Rebecca Lawson's story had taught him that impossible and unsolved were never the same thing. Summer brought visitors from across the country. Students studying forensic science, retired detectives, writers documenting famous cold cases. Many asked to see Blackwater Creek. The sheriff's office never turned it into a tourist attraction. There were no guided tours, no souvenir signs, only a small bronze marker placed near the bridge. It contained 27 simple words. "In memory of Rebecca Lawson. May every unanswered voice one day be heard, and every forgotten truth find its way into the light." People often stood before the plaque longer than expected, not because it revealed details, because it reminded them that every cold case had once belonged to a living person. Not a headline, not an evidence box. Someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone whose future had simply
stopped.
Samuel Bennett never appealed his conviction. His attorneys encouraged him to. He refused. During one prison interview requested by state psychologists, he offered an explanation that investigators had never heard before. "I stopped fighting years before they arrested me." The psychologist asked why. Samuel stared through the reinforced glass. "You can't outrun 40 winters." "What do you mean?" Every snowfall looked the same. The same road. The same bridge. The same scream. He lowered his head. "I was only free on paper." Those words never became public. The state sealed the interview. She closed the folder with mixed emotions. Justice had finally arrived. Not because Samuel had confessed. Not because he regretted what he had done. Justice arrived because evidence had survived longer than his lies. Claire Lawson visited her parents' graves every Christmas morning. For decades, she had stood there without answers. Now she brought only one sentence. "We found him." She never stayed long. She believed her parents already knew. The anonymous caller was never identified. Years turned into decades. The payphone outside the convenience store was eventually removed. The store itself closed. A new gas station replaced it. Children growing up nearby had no idea that history had quietly shifted there at exactly 2:17 one freezing January morning. The recording remained inside the evidence archive. Occasionally new software analyzed it. Each attempt ended the same way.
No identification.
No new clues. Only that trembling voice. "Check the old Miller farm." Some detectives believed they would eventually solve that mystery. Sarah hoped they never would, because whoever made that call had asked for nothing. No reward. No recognition. No interview. Only justice. Sometimes anonymity was the final act of courage. Years after retiring, Sarah returned once more to Blackwater Creek. She walked without hurry. The bridge had been rebuilt. Fresh asphalt covered the old roadway. New guardrails reflected afternoon sunlight. Only the creek itself remained unchanged. Water never cared about years. It simply continued flowing. Sarah stopped halfway across the bridge, closed her eyes, listened. No helicopters.
No search teams.
No police radios. Only birds.
Wind.
Moving water.
Peace.
She smiled softly. 43 years earlier, Fear had owned this place. Now memory did. And memory, unlike fear, could become something gentle. She placed one final white rose against the bridge railing. The petals fluttered in the breeze before drifting onto the current below. The flower floated slowly downstream, until it disappeared around the bend. Sarah watched until the water became empty again. Then she turned toward the road. Behind her, Blackwater Creek continued its endless journey through the Virginia countryside, no longer remembered as the place where a young woman vanished, but as the place where truth, buried beneath 4 decades of silence, finally found its way home.
The end.
The file remained closed. Legally, officially, permanently. Yet every solved homicide leaves behind something investigators rarely discuss in public. Questions that no courtroom can answer. Not about guilt, about consequence. Rebecca Lawson had been 26 years old when her life ended beside Blackwater Creek. The investigation proved who had taken her future. It could never reveal the future she was supposed to have. Sarah sometimes found herself thinking about that instead of the evidence. Would Rebecca have remained a librarian? Would she have married the fiancé who waited for months before finally accepting that she was never coming home? Would she have had children who inherited her quiet smile? Those answers disappeared with her. Justice could expose the truth. It could never rebuild the life stolen by violence. One rainy afternoon, nearly a year after the conviction, workers renovating the old Hanover Public Library invited Sarah inside before construction began. The building had changed very little since 1983. The same wooden circulation desk, the same narrow staircase, the same reading room where Rebecca had spent countless evenings shelving books before locking the front doors. Dust floated through the afternoon sunlight. The library felt frozen in another era. A maintenance supervisor carried over a cardboard box. "We found these in the attic." Inside were forgotten employee records, holiday decorations, old newsletters, receipts from the early 1980s. Nothing connected to the murder. Then Sarah noticed a small envelope tucked between 2 binders. The paper had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in neat blue ink, were only 3 words. "Open Christmas Eve." The envelope had never been mailed. Inside rested a folded sheet of notebook paper. It was Rebecca's handwriting. Not a confession. Not a clue. Just an unfinished letter to her parents. "I'm sorry I've been working so much lately. After Christmas, I'll finally have a weekend free. Let's drive into the mountains like we used to when I was little. I miss those days more than I probably admit." The sentence ended halfway across the page. The rest remained blank. Sarah folded the letter carefully. For several minutes, she simply stood there. That unfinished page somehow felt heavier than every piece of evidence recovered from the Miller farm, because it reminded her of something no investigation report ever captures. Victims leave unfinished conversations behind. Promises.
Plans.
Ordinary moments waiting for tomorrow. Tomorrow simply never arrives. The Lawson family donated the letter to the county archives months later. It became part of the permanent historical record, not because it helped solve the crime, because it helped people remember Rebecca as she had actually been. Not a victim.
A daughter.
A sister. A woman planning a weekend trip with her parents after Christmas. Years later, visitors reading the exhibit often spent the longest time standing in front of that single unfinished letter. Not the DNA charts. Not the crime scene photographs. Just a page ending in the middle of a sentence. Sometimes silence tells the entire story. On another December evening, Sarah returned to Blackwater Creek one final time. No ceremony had been planned. No reporters knew she was there. The lanterns had already been lit by local families. Their reflections shimmered gently across the slow-moving water. She leaned against the bridge railing and listened to the familiar sound of the creek below. A freight train echoed somewhere beyond the hills. The same lonely horn. The same direction. The same sound preserved forever beneath the anonymous phone call that had changed everything. Sarah smiled to herself. Perhaps the identity of that caller truly no longer mattered. Some heroes choose to remain invisible. Some acts of courage are never signed. All that remained was the quiet certainty that, after 42 years of silence, one forgotten voice had finally been heard. The cold wind carried across the bridge. The lantern flames flickered, but did not go out. Neither, Sarah thought, had the determination of everyone who refused to let Rebecca Lawson become just another forgotten name in an old evidence box. Behind her, the town settled into another peaceful winter night. Ahead of her, Blackwater Creek flowed steadily through the darkness, carrying no secrets anymore, only the memory of a promise fulfilled, an enduring belief that even the longest night cannot keep the truth hidden forever. Years passed. The headlines faded. Television specials stopped airing. The courthouse replaced old case displays with newer investigations. To the rest of the country, Rebecca Lawson's murder slowly became another chapter in criminal justice history. In Hanover County, it never became history. It became memory. Every detective who entered the sheriff's office for the first time noticed the same framed photograph hanging outside the cold case unit. It wasn't a crime scene picture. It wasn't evidence. It showed Rebecca standing outside the library during a summer charity book sale, smiling at someone just beyond the camera. No one knew who had taken the photograph. It had been discovered years after the trial inside a donated family photo album. Sarah insisted it be displayed where every investigator would see it. When young deputies asked why, she always gave the same answer. Because this is who we're working for. Not the headlines. Not the statistics. Not the conviction rate. The people. The photograph quietly changed the atmosphere inside the office. Case files no longer began with crime scene numbers. They began with names. Years after her retirement, Sarah received a handwritten letter from a rookie detective in another state. The detective explained that Rebecca Lawson's investigation had inspired him to reopen a forgotten homicide abandoned since the late 1980s. The evidence was old. The witnesses were elderly. The odds were poor. But one fingerprint preserved decades earlier finally identified the killer. The last sentence of the letter simply read, "If your team had given up on Rebecca, I might have given up too." Sarah folded the letter and placed it inside the same cedar box where she kept newspaper clippings from the case. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. Justice has a way of traveling farther than anyone expects. One solved case gives another detective hope. One family finding answers encourages another family to keep believing. One refusal to surrender can echo across generations. On a quiet autumn afternoon, the county dedicated a small reading room inside the renovated public library. Children filled the tables with books. Parents read stories aloud. Sunlight streamed through windows that had once looked onto a parking lot where Rebecca's stalker had waited in silence. Above the entrance hung a simple plaque, the Rebecca Lawson Reading Room. May every page remind us that knowledge outlives fear and hope outlives darkness. Visitors often stopped to read it. Most continued walking. A few remained there for several minutes. They sensed that something important had happened in this place, even if they didn't know every detail. Perhaps that was enough. The building no longer carried the weight of tragedy. It carried the weight of remembrance. Late one evening, long after retirement had settled comfortably into her life, Sarah drove once more to Blackwater Creek. The road was empty. The bridge was quiet. The water moved with the same steady rhythm it had always known. She stepped out of her car carrying nothing but a small flashlight. Not because she needed the light, because a flashlight had once become a symbol of unimaginable violence. Tonight, she wanted it to become something else. She switched it on and placed it gently against the bridge railing. Its beams stretched across the dark water.
Steady.
Unwavering. A light searching through darkness. Exactly what detectives had done for more than 4 decades. Sarah looked toward the horizon. The first stars had begun appearing above the trees. She smiled softly. "You made it home." The words disappeared into the evening breeze. No answer came back. None was needed. The creek continued flowing toward places unseen. The wind stirred the leaves. Somewhere far away, a freight train sounded its familiar horn before fading into the distance. Sarah waited until the sound vanished completely. Then she picked up the flashlight, turned it off, and walked slowly back to her car. Behind her, Blackwater Creek returned to silence. Not the silence of unanswered questions. Not the silence of forgotten evidence. But the peaceful silence that comes only after the truth has finally been found. And though the case had ended, the promise it represented endured, that no matter how many years pass, no matter how cold a trail becomes, every victim deserves someone willing to keep searching until the darkness gives way to light. The case file remained sealed inside Archive Room B. Every piece of evidence rested exactly where it belonged. Rebecca Lawson's silver necklace, the weathered notebook, the disposable camera, the library key recovered from the frozen shoreline of Blackwater Creek, the scarf that had waited more than 4 decades before science finally allowed it to speak. Nothing inside those boxes would ever change again. Evidence had completed its journey. People had not. For Claire Lawson, every ordinary morning still began the same way it had for years. She made coffee before sunrise. She opened the kitchen curtains. She looked toward the maple tree her father had planted the summer Rebecca graduated from college. For decades, she had imagined impossible endings. Perhaps Rebecca had survived. Perhaps she had lost her memory. Perhaps one day a stranger would knock on the front door, and everything would somehow make sense. Hope had carried her through years of uncertainty. Truth carried a different weight. Truth ended the waiting. But it also ended every impossible dream that had quietly survived beneath the surface. She learned something no detective could write into an investigative report. Closure is not happiness. Closure is certainty. And certainty, even when painful, is often kinder than endless questions. Across Hanover County, life continued. Children who had not even been born when Rebecca disappeared now drove across Blackwater Creek every morning on their way to school. Most knew the story. Teachers mentioned it during local history lessons. Parents spoke about it whenever the annual memorial lanterns appeared each December. To the younger generation, it sounded almost unbelievable. A murder solved after 42 years. A forgotten evidence box. Modern DNA technology. An anonymous phone call that changed everything. It sounded like something from a movie. The older residents always answered the same way. It wasn't a movie. It was our town. Those words carried a silence no documentary could ever capture. Because behind every famous cold case exists an entire community that quietly ages alongside it. People marry. Children grow up. Businesses close. Roads change. Churches replace stained glass windows. Yet one unanswered question quietly follows everyone through the years. What happened? When that question finally disappears, the town itself changes. The weight becomes lighter. The conversations become easier. The memories become gentler. Sarah Whitmore never considered Rebecca Lawson to be the greatest case of her career. Whenever journalists asked that question, she always corrected them. It wasn't my case. It belonged to everyone who refused to abandon it. She often visited the evidence archive alone. Not because she needed to review documents. Simply because she believed detectives owed every solved victim one final promise. Never become forgotten again. One afternoon, she watched a young evidence technician carefully catalog another decades-old homicide file. The technician looked exhausted. Sometimes I wonder if any of these will ever be solved. Sarah smiled. I asked Detective Granger that exact question. What did he say? He told me evidence is patient. The technician laughed quietly. What does that mean? It means evidence doesn't care whether the truth arrives tomorrow. Or 40 years from now. The young technician looked toward the endless rows of shelves. Thousands of boxes. Thousands of names. Thousands of unfinished stories. For the first time, they didn't seem hopeless. They seemed waiting. Each Christmas Eve, shortly before sunset, the people of Hanover County continued gathering near Blackwater Creek. Nobody organized the event. Nobody announced it. It simply happened. Someone always arrived first carrying a lantern. Another family followed. Then another. Children who never met Rebecca Lawson asked why everyone placed lights beside the bridge. Their parents answered softly. So nobody waiting in the darkness is ever forgotten. The children accepted the answer without further questions. Perhaps they understood more than adults realized. As darkness settled across the valley, hundreds of small lights reflected against the slow-moving water. From above, the creek looked like a ribbon of stars stretching through the countryside. Drivers slowed without being asked. Many stepped from their vehicles. Some stood only a minute. Others remained for an hour. Nobody hurried. Silence became the ceremony. Not an empty silence. A peaceful one. The kind that arrives only after decades of unanswered questions finally receive an answer. Long after retirement, Sarah made what she knew would be her final visit to the bridge. Age had slowed her steps. Gray hair escaped beneath her winter cap. The bridge itself had changed. Fresh pavement. New steel railings. Modern streetlights. Only the creek remained exactly as she remembered. Water flowed beneath the bridge with quiet determination, never stopping, never looking back. She rested both hands against the railing, closed her eyes, listened, whined through bare branches, water over hidden stones. A distant freight train rolling somewhere beyond the hills. Exactly the same sound preserved beneath static on that anonymous phone call years before. For a moment, every year disappeared. She could almost imagine Detective Granger standing beside her with his notebook. Rebecca leaving the library carrying books beneath one arm. Search volunteers calling through the snow. Crime scene tape fluttering in the cold wind. The anonymous caller standing alone beside an old payphone. 42 years compressed into one quiet breath. Sarah opened her eyes. The lanterns were already glowing along the roadside. Their reflections danced gently across the current. She smiled. Not because the tragedy had disappeared. It never would. She smiled because the silence had changed. Once, Blackwater Creek guarded a terrible secret. Now it guarded a promise fulfilled. A promise that every forgotten victim deserves another look, another question, another chance. She placed one final white rose on the bridge railing. The wind caught a single petal and carried it onto the water. It floated downstream without hurry, disappearing around the bend where the creek slipped into the Virginia wilderness. Sarah watched until it vanished completely. Then she whispered the same words she had spoken years earlier. "You made it home." The winter air carried the sentence away. The creek continued flowing toward tomorrow. And somewhere beyond the trees, beneath a sky slowly filling with stars, the long shadow cast by one December night in 1983 finally gave way to something stronger than fear. Memory.
Truth.
And a quiet justice that had arrived late, but had arrived all the same. Winter eventually gave way to another spring. The lanterns disappeared from the roadside. The snow melted into Blackwater Creek. Green returned to the trees. Birdsong replaced the heavy silence that once defined the valley. To someone passing through Hanover County for the first time, nothing seemed unusual. A quiet bridge, a narrow creek, a small public library, a courthouse standing beneath rows of old oak trees. No visible sign remained of the investigation that had once consumed an entire community. Yet stories have a way of living long after evidence is locked away. One afternoon, nearly 10 years after the conviction, a group of criminal justice students arrived from Richmond to study historic Virginia investigations. They expected dramatic crime scene photographs. They expected gruesome forensic evidence. Instead, the archivist handed them copies of Detective Thomas Granger's notebook. The students flipped through weather reports, handwritten maps, witness lists, questions without answers. One student finally looked up. "Where are the breakthroughs?" The archivist smiled. "You're holding them." The room fell quiet. "The breakthrough wasn't one discovery," he continued. "It was thousands of small decisions not to quit." The students read the notebook again. This time, they saw something different. Not failure. Persistence. Not dead ends. Preparation. Every unanswered question had become a stepping stone for the detectives who came decades later. The investigation had never truly stopped. It had simply waited for science to catch up. Across the state, Rebecca Lawson's case became one of the first examples taught whenever investigators discuss the importance of preserving evidence. A single scarf, a forgotten necklace, an old key, objects that appeared ordinary when collected, objects that became priceless decades later. Laboratory technicians often repeated the same phrase to new recruits. Treat every piece of evidence as if someone 50 years from now will depend on it. Many never forgot those words, because somewhere another Rebecca Lawson was still waiting. Another family was still living with unanswered questions. Another detective was opening another dusty box. Claire Lawson grew older. Her hair slowly turned silver. The grief never disappeared. It simply changed shape. Instead of wondering what had happened, she found herself remembering who Rebecca had been before fear entered their lives. She remembered late-night conversations in the kitchen, Christmas music drifting through the house, Rebecca laughing because she always burned the first batch of holiday cookies. Tiny memories, ordinary memories, the kind violence tries to erase. Claire refused to let it. Every year, she donated children's books to the Rebecca Lawson Reading Room. Inside every cover, librarians placed a small bookplate, given in memory of Rebecca Lawson, who believed every story deserved an ending. Children borrowed those books without knowing the history behind the name. That somehow felt right. Rebecca's memory had become connected with learning instead of loss, with hope instead of fear. Sarah Whitmore rarely spoke publicly after retirement. When she did, she ended every lecture the same way. She never spoke about DNA. She never spoke about courtroom victories. She simply held up a copy of Rebecca's unfinished Christmas letter. Then she said quietly, "This is why we investigate. Not because of headlines. Not because of statistics. Because every victim leaves behind unfinished sentences. Families spend years wondering how those sentences were supposed to end. Justice cannot finish them, but it can finally place the period where it belongs." The audience always remained silent. There was nothing else to add. Late one evening, many years later, a young deputy drove across Blackwater Creek during his first patrol shift. He slowed near the bridge without really knowing why. Moonlight shimmered across the water. The valley was completely still. His field training officer noticed. "You know the story?" The deputy nodded. "The cold case." The older officer looked toward the creek. "My father searched here in 1983. He smiled faintly. He always said something that stayed with me. What was that? The older deputy rested one hand on the steering wheel. The truth doesn't disappear. It only waits for someone patient enough to find it. They drove on. The bridge disappeared in the rearview mirror. The creek continued flowing through the darkness exactly as it had for centuries before Rebecca Lawson was born, and exactly as it would long after everyone connected to the investigation was gone. But one thing had changed forever. The silence that once belonged to fear now belonged to peace. And in that quiet, Blackwater Creek no longer guarded a mystery. It guarded a memory of a young woman whose name endured, of investigators who refused to surrender, and of a promise that even the coldest case could still find warmth in the light of truth.